Ο Νικ ξεκίνησε την καριέρα του στις αρχές της δεκαετίας του 1990 και με την πάροδο των χρόνων εξελίχθηκε μέσα από την εμπειρία του πίσω από τις μπάρες ορισμένων από τα πιο αξιόλογα μπάρς του Λονδίνου. Κατέληξε να γίνει θρύλος της μπαρ σκηνής τόσο του Λονδίνου όσο και διεθνώς. Τιμήθηκε από τις εκδόσεις Time Out ως London's Leading Cocktail Expert και το 2008 απέσπασε τη διάκριση World Mixologist Bartender of the Year στα πλαίσια ψηφοφορίας κατά τη διάρκεια των Tales of the Cocktail στη Νέα Ορλεάνη. Σήμερα, ο χρόνος του μοιράζεται ανάμεσα σε projects για μερικές από τις μεγαλύτερες μάρκες ποτών παγκοσμίως, όπως η Absolute Vodka, το Beefeater Gin και το Jameson Irish Whiskey, και σε άλλα με διακεκριμένους chefs όπως ο Giorgio Locatelli και πιο πρόσφατα ο Mark Hicks. Τελευταία, ο Nick δημιούργησε μία σειρά από 3 flavored vodkas με την επωνυμία Absolute Craft, ενώ παράλληλα ανέπτυξε για το Jameson μία σειρά συνταγών, τα Jameson Backs. Nick Strangeway.
Mr. Cretane, are you on your phone? Guys, thank you very much for turning up. Maybe you want to move forward. You'll get your drinks quicker if you come towards the front. Don't be shy. Are we doing this in translation? Or do I just speak English? I think so. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for turning up. I'm here to present for Olmeca Altos. Olmeca Altos is a product that means a hell of a lot to me because it was created for bartenders by my sadly deceased friend and business partner, Henry Besant. And I remember how much time he spent in our office formulating this particular product. And I think it was fairly pioneering. It was the first product that a big company put out there designed specifically for you. Before that, you took what they gave you and you mixed with it. This is very different to that. This was deliberately conceived to be a tequila that you mixed. And I remember Andre at the time, blending constantly to make a tequila that was approachable, that was mixable, that was for you to work with. So it's a very, very, very special product to me. And every time I have a drop of this, it reminds me of Henry. So we'll have a little drop a little bit later on. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today is a trend that I think is occurring in the bar world. And it's the trend for being local, seasonal, and foraged. And we'll go through that in turn. But I wanted to talk about it slightly in the context that most of us bartenders spend our lives following chefs around. The chefs make the breakthroughs, and then they sweep us along with them a little bit later. It's not exactly the best images. Can we turn the lights down slightly? Can we dim the lights somewhere? Just so we can actually see the screen slightly. Just so we can see the screen. You might recognize some of those chefs up there. Hopefully you will. Because there's been a massive change. That's better. Cool. The last 20 years, in Europe and in America, there's been a huge, huge rise in the popularity of food culture. And that's helped us along. We follow behind these chefs. And that has happened. The public are now very, very aware of the ingredients we use. They're very, very aware of the products that we pour for them. And it's mainly because of people like this. And I don't really want to name them all. There's Jamie Oliver. There's obviously Gordon. You may not recognize this gentleman over here, his Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall. There's obviously Ferran Adria, Heston Blumenthal, and then René Redzepi. And I want to go through a little bit about what they've done, because we're going to talk about local, seasonal, and foraged. And it's these guys that we need to look at. I think if you're looking for what might be a trend that occurs in drinks, look at what trends are occurring in food, because we will follow behind slowly afterwards. And this isn't a new thing that we follow behind the chefs. If you go back to the 19th century, and you think of that American who came over to Europe, Jerry Thomas, he came over and he went to see a guy called Alexis Soyer. Alexis Soyer was the most powerful chef in Europe at the time. He worked at the Reform Club, he did the Great Exhibition in London, and Jerry Thomas apparently interviewed for him. And if you look at Jerry Thomas's books, he has recipes that were created by a chef that he credits in his book. So we're bound to always follow these people. It's only going to be good for us. So bear in mind what food is doing. And I think you'll notice that there has been, in the last few years, a seismic shift in the way food is perceived towards these three things: seasonal, local, and foraged. Prior to this, what we were looking at, and I think it certainly happened in the bar world, is we were looking at a more molecular culture of food. And we've certainly done that in the drinks world. If you think of the guys like Tony, etc., they pioneered this molecular culture. The food world has moved away from that now. It's not that they've forgotten all they learnt, they have remembered everything they learnt, but the emphasis is no longer on the chemistry of the food. It's no longer on the technique of cooking. It's actually about the ingredients you cook and where you get your ingredients from. So, if we look at this little board, you can see the shift in the way food has changed. Over here on the left, again, it's a bit hard to see on these screens, you've got the sort of things that Heston was doing and the guys at El Bulli. And it's very much about the chemistry of food. It's about taking food, deconstructing a recipe, and reconstructing it, which you definitely see in the drinks culture. That's definitely happened if you go out to Baxter and out in New York and you see what Dave Arnold's doing, or you see what Tony Conigliari's doing. They look at a recipe and they deconstruct it and reconstruct it in an otherwise unknown way. That's what Heston was doing, and it's certainly what El Bulli were doing. The actual future of food, or the way that food is at the moment, and I live in Copenhagen, so we're going to talk about seasonal. Unfortunately, you're going to get Copenhagen seasonal products when you taste them later, not Greek ones, and I'll hopefully ask you some questions about that afterwards. I live in Denmark, and I'm very, very lucky to be very close to Noma. And earlier in the year, I was at their MAD Symposium, which is their food symposium that René runs. And you didn't see anybody talking about molecular food anymore. It was over that. They're not talking about that anymore. It's taken for granted that the chefs are skilled enough to do molecular food, that they've all experimented with molecular food. It's actually gone back to a very much more basic way of looking at things, which is looking at where you source your ingredients from. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. So if you look at the pictures on the right-hand side, and I'm sorry the images are fairly blurred on here, all of them are about the nature that surrounds René. René was very unusual when he set up. It's not a new thing to do this thing that's local. It dates back, well, it dates back since before refrigeration. If you wanted to make, if you harvested a product, you had to preserve your product, you had to get your product from the local area, you didn't have transportation. And then if you go on a little bit further on in time, so in the 19th century that dies out, it doesn't really, hello Mr. Estes. This is like being the warm-up act for the Rolling Stones. There, I know, exactly. And we thought the Who had already played. So let me go back a little bit. So obviously, in the 19th century, everybody bought local ingredients and seasonal ingredients, and they actually did forage to get their food and their drinks. That sort of like died out. If you think about the Second World War, there's a time where food is hard to get. They suddenly start rationing food. They change the way food production is. It becomes a much more industrialized process. And people start to forget about these old ways of doing things. And it wasn't until the sort of like 60s, when there was this, Tom will remember these days, the idealistic era of the 60s, when a couple of writers and a couple of chefs started looking back in time to what they considered a golden period, where you did buy from your local place. You did eat what was seasonal. And in particular, there's a lady there, her name is Alice Waters, and she had a restaurant out in San Francisco. And she basically went out to France when she was 19, was trying to be a chef, went into a restaurant and actually ordered some trout. And what she witnessed was the chef catching the trout. Catching the trout, killing the trout, cooking the trout, and serving her the trout. And American food culture at this point was so different from that. Basically, everything came out of a can. Everything was an industrialized process. And she wasn't used to seeing this product being put in front of her that she saw being caught. So she decided that she would actually set up a restaurant to do that sort of thing. And so she was very, very pioneering in the way that she worked. And her restaurant, Chez Panisse, which again, I refer back to Tom, I'm sure he's aware of Chez Panisse's influence. Chez Panisse was way ahead of its time. If we look at the second name up there, there's a guy called Richard Mabey. And Richard, I remember growing up in the 70s, I remember my parents had a book called Food for Free, which I never understood. It had pictures of mushrooms in it and trees and fruit. But the sort of things you could find in the countryside, not the sort of stuff you found in your local supermarket. And I was always intrigued about it. I never really understood what it was. And again, he'd set out to write this book that went back in time to a time when you went out and got your ingredients for free, when you went out and foraged for ingredients. So he was ahead of the curve. He was thinking about things that we now think of as normal. And the final point there is the slow food movement. Back in 1986, there were a group of Italians who decided that the way everything was going industrially meant there was a very, very real danger of losing your food heritage. And so they set up the slow food movement to encourage farmers and consumers to purchase quality products that were grown in the locality, so you didn't lose recipes over the course of time. So these are the sort of like the roots of what I see going on in the restaurant world nowadays. So what exactly do they mean? Because they can be quite confusing. Local, I think, is probably the most confusing thing, because local in America means one thing, and local over here means something quite different. So if you live in America, there's no definition in law. They did try and set out a definition in Congress, and they basically said that for something to be called local on its packaging means it has to come from within 400 miles. Well, if you take that to the context of Greece, 400 miles probably goes to one of your borders. Certainly if I'm in England, it's not local when I've gone to 400 miles away. So it's one of those things you have to judge on your own heart. If you think if I live in London, I would consider local something to be within 40 miles of London, not 400 miles. Bear in mind, somewhere like Texas, they also stipulate in their law that for it to be called local or regional, it has to come from that state or an adjoining state. Texas is the size of France. So again, it's a bit of a blurred thing. So you need to put your foot down and decide what local is. It's a very difficult thing, but I would highly recommend that you do it, because when you buy locally, you will get the best produce. And even in a big city like Athens, there will be places on the outskirts of Athens where you can buy locally. Such is the trend of this, or the fashion for this. Even back in 2008, a company as big as Walmart decided it was going to invest $400 million in purchasing locally. So it's not just a trend that's happening in cutting-edge restaurants, it's happening everywhere. The supermarkets are following this thing. So we need to be ahead of the curve and start to take that influence into our drinks. Now, there are lots of benefits to this being local. There's been a lot of research done as to what purchasing locally does for your community. And I know full well, if I'm in London, and it's a big bustling city, and I need to purchase something, I will rush to the supermarket on my own. I will go in there, I'll load my shopping bags full of shit, and I'll go back and regret buying it, because it's normally full of crap. But I'll spend a fortune doing it. Whereas if I go to my local farmer's market, I would actually probably go with somebody and arrange to meet them there, and we'll walk around and we'll discuss the products that we're purchasing. We'll even talk to the person who produces it, because they tend to be the person serving you. So there's this beneficial action that happens when you buy locally. When you go to these places, they are designed for human contact. Supermarkets are designed to take you away from human contact. They are there deliberately to make you purchase. And Alex was actually discussing earlier that he finds it really expensive in London because he ends up popping into Tesco's and he never spends less than £50. That's probably because they put the champagne right by the till with Alex, but they are designed to make you spend on shit you don't need. When you go to a local market or a farmer's market, you end up purchasing things through discussion with the producer. And you end up being in touch with the source of your food or your ingredients for cocktails. So it has this benefit to the community. It's a sociable activity. It benefits the community in that it brings the community together. When you purchase from someone locally, they're part of your environment. So you can influence what they grow for you. You can tell them, if you didn't like your chicken that week and it wasn't very good, you can go right back to them. Have you ever tried taking the chicken back to a supermarket? They'll tell you to fuck off because they just won't believe that you're right. Other people care. The local farmer cares that you go back to him. So it's very, very good for your community. And I don't want to be too hippie about this, but it is something I believe in a lot. It has environmental benefits. The environmental benefits are incredible because if you minimize the amount of processing that you do on a product and you minimize the amount of transport it needs, it is better for greenhouse gases. It's going to be better. There are more greenhouse gases emitted by the storage and the transport of most of your goods than there are by your local people producing these things.